Don't worry, I'll not be revealing in the screensaver whether Free is guilty of the 2 crimes she's accused of in The 12. You'll have to discover the wildly exciting denouement for yourself if you binge-watch this Flemish series. I'm not focusing here on the accused and the victims of the 2 murders the case is about. I will be following the title of the series and thus focus on the jury. 12 ordinary people have to deliver a verdict in a murder case. I wondered if this number has biblical origins. And yes, the story goes that there is a relationship. Our 12-member jury is said to date back to the year 725 AD, when the Welsh king Morgan ap Morgan took inspiration from Jesus and the 12 apostles to have a college of 12 citizens assist the judge in important court cases. Now, even with Jesus, this number goes back to an existing tradition. The number 12 traditionally expresses fullness in a lot of culture. This has an astronomical ground. The period between the 2 moments when the sun is at its highest possible point, at noon, is called a year. During that period, the moon goes through its cycle 12 times. 12 months thus fill the year. Hence, our culture originally counted in 12s instead of 10s. You still notice this in the names of the numbers. Today we count in a tens system. At 20, 30, 40 and so on, we keep counting with 1, 2 to 9. But after the first 10, we don't. From 10 we don't go to 10, 1, but to 11 and 12. Only then is the original sequence complete. We find the same principle in the Old Testament. Jacob has 12 sons. They form the basis of the nation of Israel and give their names to the 12 tribes that make up the nation. To be fair, it's just a bit more complex in practice, but we won't go into that now. The point is that 12 refers to the community as a whole. So when Jesus gathers 12 men around him, it's a picture of the universal movement he wants to set in motion. And the 12-man jury expresses the same thing. They represent a whole community when they have to pass judgment on someone from that community. The strength of this TV series lies in the insight into the lives of some of the jurors. They may have to judge, but there are also some things wrong in their lives. Think of the photographer who is in debt and feels the heat of the bailiff. Or the young mother who is a victim of partner violence, both mentally and physically. Think of the widower sinking into loneliness and driven mad by his noisy neighbours. Or the handsome chairman of the jury, whom we find out is herself a victim of a homejacking in which both her parents were killed. Each jury member performs his duty with his own baggage in the background. This inevitably leads to tension. This is most evident with Yuri, who runs his father's construction company with his brother. When a Brazilian illegal worker is seriously injured at one of their sites, the brothers don't call for help but take the victim to a bus stop with the intention that an ambulance could pick him up there. Despite a police investigation, they get away with it. But when the man dies in hospital, Yuri can no longer cope with the guilt. How can I judge anyone when I myself am responsible for the death of an innocent man? He wails. It's no different in the story of the 12 apostles. We are regularly told that they don't realize what Jesus is ultimately about. And 2 names stand out in particular. First, Judas Iscariot, of course. He's the one who hands Jesus over to the authorities so they can eliminate him. He even receives blood money for it, 30 pieces of silver. Luke tells us that he commits suicide out of remorse. Less spectacular, and therefore even more interesting, is Peter, The cocky leader of the apostles sometimes scores high marks. "You are Peter, and on you I will build my church," Jesus confides in him. But moments later, he goes completely wrong. During Jesus' arrest, he resorts to violence, very much against Jesus' wishes. And at a crucial moment, he even denies his Lord. While Jesus is being interrogated and tortured, several people recognize Peter as Jesus' disciple, but he strenuously denies it until the cock crows and Peter remembers that Jesus had predicted this. As the jurors in the TV series, the apostles are ordinary people with their own stories. They have talents and limitations, and they can go wrong. Jesus is very aware of this and often reminds his disciples, "Judge not lest you be judged," for instance, he presses on their hearts. And why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or consider the moment when they stand with many around the woman who legally deserves the death penalty for having committed adultery. It's there that Jesus says, "He who is without sin, cast the first stone." In the church, we assume that no one is perfect. Every Mass starts with a confession of guilt, not because we assume that our church is filled with bad people, but because we recognize that we are human beings, colliding with our littleness and limitedness, and sometimes even with our own evil. Does this mean that we should not engage in judicial justice, and that a people's jury like the one in the series goes against the Christian model of society? Absolutely not, of course. There is also such a thing as the drive for justice. We must make an honest effort to organize our life together as justly as possible. In biblical context, this desire takes shape in the role of the king. It's his responsibility to pursue justice. King Solomon, in particular, stands out in this regard. The first book of Kings relates that God says to Solomon, "What do you want me to give you?" What a question. What would you go for? I bet it's something else than Solomon's request. "Give your servant a perceptive spirit to be able to speak justice to your people and distinguish between good and evil." The poor judges in the 12 know exactly what this prayer is about. They have to decide on Free's life based on conflicting testimonies, inconclusive evidence, and many black holes in the story of events. An impossible task, and yet they fulfill their duty and make a verdict, which I'm not revealing right now. What I can say is that I wouldn't have known how to judge. Justice and righteousness will never be fully realized in our world. They're behind the horizon, Jesus says, at the end of time. And they will not be a human achievement, but a gift from God. The Last Judgment, this event is called. And it has often been depicted in the history of the church as something frightening and terrifying. And of course, it will be no fun facing our sinfulness, but fundamentally, it's about a joyful promise. Christians call this the kingdom of God. There God's glory will reign, and there righteousness will prevail. No joy for the perpetrators, but a victory for the victims. And the 12 play a role there too, according to the Gospel. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus confides to his apostles, "When the Son of Man shall be seated on the throne of his glory, you also who have followed me shall be seated on 12 thrones, ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel." And meanwhile, we have to make do with the small, fragile steps we can take here and now to aspire a just world. I like how this becomes visible in the fate of Yuri, the juror with the construction company. At the end of the series, he gives himself in to the police and is arrested for the death of the Brazilian undeclared worker. This seemingly tragic ending for him feels curiously like a happy ending. Someone who has committed a mistake takes responsibility and is willing to submit to justice and pay for it. Not coincidentally, this is also the moment when his passionate relationship with Holly symbolically deepens into a true love affair. Love can only thrive where truth and justice prevail. See, and that is a primal Christian message. Love can only thrive where truth and justice reign. That 12 people are serving truth and justice on behalf of all of us during a trial is a beautiful image of our permanent mission as church and as society.